The courtroom smelled like old paper and floor polish. Sunlight came through tall windows, cutting sharp lines across rows of wooden benches. People sat quietly, some with arms crossed, others with hands folded tight in their laps. A few glanced at the clock. Others stared at the floor. No one spoke. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on your shoulders. At the front, behind a high wooden bench, sat the magistrate. He was in his late 50s with silver hair combed neatly to the side and reading glasses perched low on his nose. He'd been on the bench for over 20 years. People said he ran a tight courtroom. No nonsense, no delays, no emotional outbursts. He believed the law was clear, and feelings had no place in it. Today's case was supposed to be routine, a custody hearing. Nothing dramatic. Just another file in a long line of them. Lawyers stood on either side of the room, shuffling papers, whispering last-minute notes to their clients. One side represented a parent trying to regain custody after a period of instability. The other side argued the child was better off where they were, with a relative who'd stepped in during a rough patch. It wasn't a glamorous case. No headlines, no TV cameras, just real life, messy and complicated, playing out in slow motion. Outside, the world kept moving. Cars passed. Birds called from the trees. But inside, time seemed to slow. The magistrate cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began to speak in that calm, measured voice he always used. Given the evidence presented and considering the best interest of the minor, he paused, glancing down at his notes. I find that temporary guardianship should remain with the maternal aunt, pending further review in 6 months. A soft sigh came from one side of the room. Someone shifted in their seat. A pen clicked. It was over. Just like that, but then a sound, not loud, not angry, just a small footstep on the tile floor. Then another. All eyes turned toward the back of the courtroom. There, standing just inside the double doors, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, barefoot, wearing a faded pink dress that was a little too big for her. Her hair was tangled, and one strap of her dress hung loose over her shoulder. In one hand, she clutched a stuffed rabbit, its fur worn thin from being held too many nights. She didn't run, didn't cry, didn't look scared. She just walked, slowly, steadily, down the center aisle, past the benches, past the lawyers, straight toward the bench. The bailiff stood up, hand reaching for his radio. "Ma'am, you can't be." But before he could finish, the girl stopped. Right in front of the magistrate's bench, she looked up. Her eyes were wide, clear and steady, not defiant, not confused, just sure. And then she spoke, just 4 words, simple, quiet. But they hit the room like a stone, dropped into still water. Every person froze. The magistrate's pen slipped from his fingers and rolled off the desk. His face, usually so composed, so unreadable, went pale. Not just pale, ashen, like someone had drained the color right out of him. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He blinked once, twice, as if trying to convince himself he hadn't heard what he just heard. The lawyers exchanged glances. One of them dropped her notepad. The bailiff took a step forward, then stopped, unsure what to do. Even the court reporter who typed through shouting matches and sobbing witnesses had stopped typing. Her fingers hovered over the keys. The girl didn't move. She just stood there holding her rabbit, waiting. No one knew what to say because those 4 words, they weren't random. They weren't childish nonsense. They were specific, pointed, and they carried a weight far too heavy for such a small voice. In that moment, the whole room changed. The air felt different, thicker, charged, like before a storm breaks. The routine hearing was forgotten. The custody file lay closed. All that mattered was this child, standing alone in a place where children rarely speak. And when they do, no one expects them to say something that cracks the world open. People would later argue about what exactly happened next. Some said the magistrate stood up too fast and knocked over his water glass. Others swore he whispered something under his breath, something like, "Not again." But everyone agreed on one thing. Whatever the girl said, it struck a nerve deep inside him. Not just as a judge. As a person, the bailiff finally moved, crouching down a few feet away so he didn't tower over her. "Hey there," he said gently. "What's your name, sweetheart?" She didn't answer. Her eyes never left the magistrate. A woman in the front row, later identified as a social worker assigned to the case, stood slowly. "I know her," she said, voice low. She's the child from the other file, the one that was closed last year. A murmur rippled through the room. The magistrate finally found his voice. It was rough, quieter than usual. Is that you? The girl nodded once. He swallowed hard, looked down at his hands, then back at her. You weren't supposed to be here today. I know, she said, but I had to tell you. And with that she turned and walked back the way she came, down the aisle, past the stunned faces, out the heavy courtroom doors, which swung shut behind her with a soft click. Silence returned. But it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. This one was full of questions, full of unease, full of things no one wanted to say out loud. The magistrate sat very still for a long time. Then, without looking at anyone, he said, "Adjourned." He didn't gather his papers. Didn't say another word. Just stood, straightened his robe, and walked out through the side door that led to his chambers. His steps were slower than usual. Outside, the hallway was empty. But the girl was gone. No one saw where she went. Later, people would piece things together. They'd pull old files, make calls, ask questions they should have asked a year ago. But in that moment, all anyone could think about was those 4 words, and the look on the magistrate's face when he heard them. Because in a room built on rules, evidence and procedure, something raw and human had just walked in barefoot and changed everything. No one left right away. They sat in their seats, staring at the empty space where the girl had stood. Some looked at each other, searching for answers in faces that held none. Others kept their eyes down as if afraid to meet anyone's gaze. The court clerk finally stood and began collecting files, her movements mechanical. The lawyers packed up their briefcases without speaking. The social worker stayed behind, arms crossed. Eyes distant, and somewhere, not far from the courthouse, a little girl sat on a bench under a tree, holding her rabbit, watching the sky. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she'd done what she had to do, because sometimes truth doesn't come in long speeches or legal arguments. Sometimes it comes in 4 quiet words, spoken by someone no one expected to speak at all. The 4 words hung in the air like smoke after a fire, visible, thick, impossible to ignore. No one in the courtroom had expected them. No one knew what to do with them. But everyone knew deep down that something had shifted, permanently. Outside, the courthouse steps were quiet. A breeze stirred the leaves of the old oak trees lining the street. Birds chirped like nothing had happened. But inside, the mood was different. People moved slowly, as if afraid that speaking too loudly or moving too fast might shatter whatever fragile truth had just been spoken. The magistrate didn't return to the bench that day. His chambers stayed closed. A clerk posted a handwritten note on the courtroom door. Proceedings postponed indefinitely. No explanation. No details. Just those 3 words scribbled in shaky handwriting. Meanwhile, the girl was found sitting on a bench near the courthouse garden, still barefoot, still holding her rabbit. A kind-looking woman in a blue uniform, part of the court's child liaison team, approached her gently. She didn't ask questions right away. Just sat beside her, offered a bottle of water, and waited. After a few minutes, the girl looked up. "Is he going to listen this time?" she asked. The woman didn't pretend not to know who he was. She just nodded slowly. "I think he has to." Back inside, the lawyers were already on their phones. Not about the custody case anymore. That felt like ancient history now. They were calling supervisors, colleagues, even old contacts in child protective services. Because those 4 words, they weren't just personal. They pointed to something bigger. Something buried. One of the attorneys, the one who'd represented the aunt in the custody hearing, pulled the social worker aside. "That file you mentioned, the one from last year, what happened with it?" The social worker hesitated. It was complicated. The allegations were serious, but there wasn't enough evidence. The adult witnesses backed out. The child stopped talking. Eventually, the case was closed due to lack of cooperation. "But she's the same child?" "Yes. And she just walked into court today and said..." The lawyer trailed off, unable to repeat the words out loud. The social worker nodded. She remembered, and she came back. News traveled fast in a place like this, not through headlines or social media, but through hushed conversations in hallways, quick calls between offices, and glances exchanged over coffee. Within hours, people who hadn't thought about that old case in months were pulling dusty folders from locked cabinets. What they found wasn't pretty. The original report had come from a school nurse. The girl had shown up with bruises on her arms. When asked, she'd said she'd fallen, but the pattern didn't match a fall. The nurse filed a report. An investigation began. Interviews were scheduled. But then things went quiet. The adult who was supposed to be interviewed never showed up. Phone calls went unanswered. The school said the girl stopped coming for a week. When she returned, she wouldn't speak to counselors. Eventually, the file was marked inactive, but now, standing in the light of those 4 words, the gaps in the story looked less like dead ends, and more like places where someone had worked hard to make sure nothing was found. The magistrate, meanwhile, hadn't left his chambers. When the chief judge finally knocked and stepped inside, he found him sitting at his desk, staring at an old photograph. It was black and white, slightly curled at the edges. A younger version of himself stood beside another man, both in robes, smiling after what looked like a graduation or a ceremony. "I knew him," the magistrate said quietly, without looking up. "Back when I first started. He handled family cases too." The chief judge waited. "He had a case years ago. A little boy. Said things no one believed. They called it fantasy. Trauma response. The adults denied everything." The boy recanted. "Case closed," he paused. 6 months later, the boy was gone, overdosed, 12 years old. He finally looked up. His eyes were red. I read the file after. Saw what I'd missed. What we all missed. I told myself I'd never let that happen again. But today, the chief judge began. Today, she said the same 4 words that boy wrote in his notebook, the one they found under his bed. His voice cracked. Word for word, silence filled the room. Outside, the sun dipped lower in the sky. Shadows stretched across the courthouse lawn. The girl was now at a nearby safe house, wrapped in a soft blanket, eating soup with a counselor who didn't push, didn't pry, just stayed close. She hadn't asked to go home. Hadn't asked for toys or TV. She just sat quietly, occasionally glancing out the window, as if waiting to see if the world had changed. And in a way, it had, because those 4 words, so simple, so direct, had done what months of reports and interviews couldn't. They'd forced people to look. Really look. That evening, a team from Child Protective Services held an emergency meeting. Not in a conference room with name tags and PowerPoint slides, but around a kitchen table in a small office downtown. No titles, no formalities, just people who knew the system's cracks better than anyone, trying to figure out how to keep this child safe now that she'd risked everything to speak up. She didn't just say it to him, one caseworker said. She said it to all of us, like she knew we were listening even if we pretended not to be. Another nodded. Kids don't forget. They just learn to stay quiet, until they can't. By nightfall, a new case file was opened, not under the old number, not as a follow-up. This one had a fresh cover, a new code, and a note at the top in bold letters. Priority. Immediate action required. The magistrate requested to be removed from any involvement. Not because he wanted to hide, but because he knew his past, his guilt. His fear might cloud his judgment now. "Let someone else do this right," he told the chief judge. "I had my chance." But even as he stepped back, he couldn't stop thinking about her voice. Calm, clear, unshaken. How had she held on to those words all this time? How had she known exactly when and where to say them? The answer perhaps was simpler than anyone wanted to admit. She'd said them because no one else would, and sometimes the truth doesn't need a megaphone. It just needs one voice, small, steady, and brave enough to break the silence. As the city lights flickered on and the courthouse emptied for the night, a single officer stayed behind, rewatching the security footage from that afternoon. He watched the girl walk in, watched the magistrate go pale, watched the room fall still. He paused the video right at the moment she spoke. He didn't have sound, but he'd heard the words from witnesses. He typed them into his notes, then stared at them for a long time. Then he closed his laptop, stood up, and walked out into the cool evening air. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in years, he felt like maybe, just maybe, the system might finally get it right. Because sometimes all it takes is 4 words, and one child who refuses to be invisible. The next morning, the courthouse felt different. Not because anything had changed on the surface, The same marble floors, the same echoing hallways, the same coffee cart parked near the entrance. But because something invisible had shifted. People moved with more care, spoke in lower voices, looked at each other a little longer as if trying to read what wasn't being said. Inside a small office on the third floor, a team gathered not in suits and ties, but in jeans and cardigans with mugs of tea and tired eyes. These weren't prosecutors or judges. They were investigators, social workers, and child advocates who'd spent years navigating the quiet tragedies that never made the news. And now they had a new mission. Follow the trail the little girl had pointed to with just 4 words. It started with old records. Not digital files, but paper ones. Yellowed, stapled, tucked into boxes labeled with case numbers no one had touched in over a year. They pulled them out carefully, like handling something fragile. And as they read, a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't just one missed call or one canceled interview. It was a series of small silences, each one reasonable on its own, but together forming a wall so thick the truth couldn't get through. A teacher who noticed the girl flinching when adults raised their voices but was told she's just shy. A neighbor who heard shouting late at night but assumed it was none of their business. A doctor who noted unexplained injuries but accepted the explanation given without pushing further. No one had meant to look away. That was the hardest part. They'd just stopped asking. Now they were asking again. Phone calls went out. Not demanding, not accusatory, just gentle, persistent questions. Do you remember this case? Was there anything that felt off even if you couldn't prove it? Would you be willing to talk again now that the child has spoken? Some people hesitated. Others broke down in tears. One retired school counselor called back 3 times just to say, "I should have done more. I knew something wasn't right." Meanwhile, the girl stayed in a quiet home on the edge of town, run by a woman who'd fostered dozens of children over the years. The house smelled like cinnamon and laundry soap. There were books on every shelf, soft blankets on the couch, and a golden retriever who followed the girl around like a silent guardian. She didn't talk much at first. Just watched, listened, played quietly with the dog, but slowly she began to open up. Not in long stories, but in small pieces. A drawing here, a whispered sentence there. He said no one would believe me. I tried to tell my teacher, but she said I must have dreamed it. I kept the rabbit because it was the only thing that didn't lie. The foster caregiver didn't push. She just sat nearby, mending socks or watering plants, giving the girl space to breathe. She knew that healing didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in moments like these, when a child finally felt safe enough to stop holding her breath. Back in the city, the investigation deepened. New interviews were scheduled. Old ones were revisited. This time, people were more honest, less afraid. Maybe it was the girl's courage that gave them theirs, or maybe it was the realization that silence, even when well-intentioned, could do more harm than speaking up ever could. One key witness finally agreed to talk, a former housekeeper who'd worked in the home where the girl had lived. She'd left her job suddenly a year ago and moved out of state. When reached by phone, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I saw things, heard things, but I needed the job. My kids needed to eat. I told myself it wasn't my place." Now she gave a detailed statement, not full of drama but full of truth. Dates, routines, small moments that added up to something big. Like how the child was never allowed to have visitors, how certain rooms were always locked, how punishments weren't shouted, they were whispered, calm and cold. Her testimony didn't scream. It whispered back, and that whisper was louder than any shout. At the same time, a review board was quietly formed, not to assign blame, but to understand how the system failed. They looked at policies, training gaps, communication breakdowns. They asked hard questions. Why did it take a child walking into court barefoot to get attention? Why do we wait for proof instead of listening to possibility? Why do we protect processes more than people? These weren't easy conversations. But for the first time, people were willing to have them. The magistrate, though no longer involved in the case, requested a copy of the old file, the one from the boy years ago. He read it late into the night under a dim lamp in his study. Page after page of missed signs, ignored pleas, and bureaucratic delays. When he finished, he sat in the dark for a long time. Then he wrote a letter, not to defend himself, but to recommend changes. Mandatory trauma training for all court staff, direct access to child advocates during hearings, anonymous reporting channels for school personnel. He didn't send it to the media, didn't post it online, just handed it to the chief judge the next morning with a simple note, so no one else has to walk into a courtroom alone. Meanwhile, the girl began to smile. Small, rare smiles, but real ones. She started drawing pictures of trees, houses, and rabbits with big eyes. One day she asked if she could plant something in the backyard. The caregiver handed her a packet of sunflower seeds. Together they dug small holes in the soft earth, dropped in the seeds, and covered them gently. "They take time," the caregiver said, "but they always reach for the light." The girl nodded, brushing dirt off her knees. "I think I'm starting to." As the days passed, the case moved forward, not with dramatic arrests or televised press conferences, but with steady, careful steps. Protective orders were filed. Supervised visits were suspended. A new guardian ad litem was assigned, someone trained specifically in child trauma, who would speak only for the child's best interest, not for any adult's convenience. And through it all, the girl remained calm. Not because she wasn't scared, she was, but because for the first time she wasn't carrying the weight alone. People often think justice is loud, gavels slamming, voices rising, headlines flashing. But real justice is often quiet. It's a social worker staying late to rewrite a report. It's a teacher calling child services even when it feels awkward. It's a magistrate stepping aside so someone else can do better. And sometimes it's a little girl planting sunflowers, trusting that something good can still grow, even after the darkest winter. No one knew how the story would end yet. But for now, in that small house with the golden dog and the smell of cinnamon, a child was learning to breathe again. And that, more than anything, was the first true sign that change had begun. Document Part 4 when 400 words. Weeks passed. The case moved slowly, as these things often do, not in leaps but in careful steps. But beneath the surface, something deeper was shifting. And it wasn't just about one child or one courtroom anymore. It was about the man who'd sat behind the bench that day, the magistrate whose face had gone pale at 4 simple words. He hadn't spoken publicly since. He'd recused himself from the case, stepped back from hearings involving children, and spent most of his days in his office with the door closed. Colleagues noticed he looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from long hours, but the kind that settles in your bones, the weight of something you can't undo. One rainy afternoon, he asked to meet with the chief judge. Not in a formal conference room, but in the courthouse's old library. A quiet space lined with law books no one used anymore. Dust floated in the slanted light from the high windows. The 2 men sat across from each other at a wooden table, steam rising from their mugs. "I need to tell you something," the magistrate said, his voice low. Not as a judge, just as a person. He took a deep breath. Then he began to talk. Not about the girl, not about the current case, but about another one. Years ago, a boy no older than 10 who'd come to court with bruises on his wrists and fear in his eyes. He'd whispered something during a recess, just 4 words, almost identical to the ones spoken recently. But back then, no one had believed him. The adults denied it. The evidence was inconclusive. The boy, overwhelmed and scared, eventually said he'd made it up. The case was closed. 6 months later, the boy was found in a motel room, alone. He never made it to his 11th birthday. "I signed off on that closure," the magistrate said, staring into his coffee. "I told myself I was being fair, that I needed hard proof. But what I really did was choose comfort over courage." The chief judge didn't interrupt, just listened. "I told myself I'd learned from it," the magistrate continued, "that I'd be more careful, more open. But when she walked in and said those same words, it was like time folded in on itself. I saw him again, and I realized I hadn't changed enough. The system hadn't changed enough." He looked up, eyes glistening. "She shouldn't have had to come here alone. She shouldn't have had to be the brave one." Silence filled the room, thick with regret and something else. Resolve. Later that week, the magistrate did something unexpected. He requested a meeting with the child's advocate, the woman who'd been appointed to speak for the girl's best interests. He didn't ask for updates on the case, didn't try to explain himself. He just asked one question: "Is she safe now?" The advocate nodded. "She is. Is she being heard?" "Yes, every day." He nodded slowly, then handed her a sealed envelope. Give this to her when she's ready, not now. Only when she asked about me. Inside was a letter, short, simple, no excuses. Just 2 sentences. I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner. Thank you for giving me another chance to do better. He never expected a reply, and he never got one. But that wasn't the point. What happened next surprised everyone, even him. He began showing up at training sessions for new court staff. Not as a speaker, but as a participant. He sat in the back, took notes, asked questions. He listened as trauma specialists explained how fear can look like silence, how children often protect the very people hurting them, how evidence isn't always a photo or a document. It can be a flinch, a drawing, a single sentence spoken in a quiet voice. At first, people were uneasy. They didn't know what to say to him. But he made it easy. He didn't defend his past. Didn't pretend he had all the answers. He just said, I'm here to learn. One young clerk, fresh out of college, finally asked him why he was doing this. You could have just retired quietly, she said. No one would have blamed you. He thought for a moment. Because walking away wouldn't fix what I helped break. And if I can help make sure another child doesn't have to walk into a courtroom barefoot just to be heard, then maybe some good can still come from my mistakes. His honesty opened a door. Soon others began sharing their own regrets. The teacher who ignored a student's note, the officer who dismissed a call as family drama, the lawyer who pushed a client to drop a case to avoid a messy trial. It wasn't about shame. It was about responsibility. And slowly, quietly, the culture began to shift. New protocols were drafted, not by committees far away, but by the people who'd lived the failures. Courtrooms started keeping a trained child advocate on call during sensitive hearings. Judges received updated training on trauma responses. School staff were given clear, simple steps for reporting concerns without fear of overreacting. None of it was flashy. No press releases, no awards. Just real people choosing day by day to do things differently. Back at the safe house, the girl didn't know any of this. She didn't need to. She was busy with other things. Learning to ride a bike, reading stories under a blanket fort, laughing when the dog stole her socks. She still had quiet days. Days when she stared out the window or held her rabbit extra tight. But those days were fewer now. One afternoon, while helping in the garden, she asked the caregiver, "Do you think he's sorry?" The caregiver didn't pretend not to know who she meant. "I think he's trying to be." The girl nodded, pulling a weed from around the base of a sunflower. Trying is better than nothing. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever, but it was understanding. And sometimes that's where healing begins. Meanwhile, the magistrate made one final request. He asked to be removed from the bench permanently, not as punishment, but as a choice. "I've served long enough," he told the chief judge. "Now it's time to listen more than I speak." His last day was quiet. No ceremony. Just a handshake, a box of personal items, and a long look at the empty courtroom before he turned off the lights. As he walked out the courthouse doors for the last time, he paused. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the steps. Somewhere in the distance, children were laughing, playing near the fountain in the square. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was walking in the right direction. Because real change doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes it starts with a child's voice, and sometimes it's carried forward by someone who finally chooses to listen. Spring came quietly that year. Not with fanfare or sudden warmth, but with small signs. A patch of green pushing through cracked pavement, birds returning to the courthouse eaves, the first dandelion blooming in the grass near the steps where the girl had once stood barefoot. Life in the city moved on, as it always does. Courtrooms filled and emptied. Cases opened and closed. But something had changed. Something subtle, like a shift in the wind that you feel before you see it. The little girl never returned to that courtroom. She didn't need to. Her words had done what they were meant to do. She was safe now, living in a home where doors stayed open, voices stayed kind, and bedtime stories ended with, "I love you," not silence. She still carried her rabbit everywhere, though its fur was even thinner now, worn soft from being held through storms both outside and within. She started school again, not the one she'd left behind, but a new one, smaller and quieter. Her teacher had been trained in trauma-informed care, not because of a policy memo, but because someone had insisted it mattered. At first the girl sat in the back watching. But slowly she raised her hand, drew pictures, made a friend who liked sunflowers too. No one asked her about the past. They just let her be, and that more than anything, gave her room to grow. Meanwhile, the ripple from those 4 words kept spreading, farther and wider than anyone expected. In the courthouse, new rules took root. Not as rigid mandates, but as shared understandings. Judges now paused when a child seemed uneasy, even if nothing was said out loud. Court clerks kept a list of local child advocates taped inside their desk drawers. Lawyers were encouraged to ask, "What does the child need?" Not just what does the law allow. Training sessions became regular, not just for judges, but for bailiffs, receptionists, even maintenance staff. Because sometimes, the person who notices a child flinch isn't the one in the robe. It's the one who empties the trash or fixes the lights. One of the most powerful changes came from an idea no one had thought of before. A small, unmarked room near the family court entrance, painted in soft blues and greens, with books, toys, and a counselor always on hand. It wasn't called an interview room or a holding area. They simply called it the quiet room. Any child who walked into the courthouse, whether for a hearing, a visit, or just because they'd followed a grown-up inside, could go there. No questions. No pressure. Just safety, and it was used. More than anyone expected, the magistrate, now retired, didn't disappear. He started volunteering with a nonprofit that trained future lawyers and social workers. He didn't lecture. He listened. And when asked about his time on the bench, he'd say only this: "I used to think justice meant following the rules perfectly. Now I know it means seeing the person behind the file." He never sought forgiveness. But in the way he showed up, humbly, consistently, without excuses, people began to trust him again. Not as a judge, but as someone who'd learned the hard way that fairness isn't just about procedure. It's about heart. As for the case itself, it never became a headline. There were no dramatic trials, no viral videos, no late-night news specials. The adults involved faced consequences, not through spectacle, but through quiet accountability. Supervised visits were permanently revoked. Legal guardianship was granted to the relative who'd stepped in during the crisis, a woman who'd never asked for praise, only for the child to be safe, and that was enough. Months later, on a warm afternoon, the girl stood in her backyard, staring at a row of tall sunflowers. They'd grown taller than her, their golden faces turned toward the sun. She'd watered them every day, even when it rained, even when she didn't feel like it. The caregiver came out with 2 glasses of lemonade and sat beside her on the porch step. "They're beautiful," she said. The girl nodded. "They took a long time." "Some things do," the caregiver replied, "but they're worth waiting for." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching bees hover around the blooms. Then the girl asked, "Do you think anyone remembers what I said?" The caregiver thought for a moment. "Not everyone, but the right people do. And they're making sure it matters." That was all the girl needed to hear. She never spoke those 4 words again. Not to reporters, not to counselors, not even in her sleep. They'd served their purpose. They'd broken the silence. Now she was building something new, something made of laughter, scraped knees, bedtime stories, and sunflowers. And in a way, that was the real victory. Because healing doesn't look like a courtroom drama. It looks like a child eating breakfast without flinching. It looks like a teacher noticing a drawing and saying, "Tell me about this." It looks like a retired judge sitting in a classroom, listening more than he speaks. The system didn't become perfect overnight. There were still missed calls, closed doors, children who stayed quiet too long. But now there were also more open ears, more willing hands, more people who understood that sometimes the most powerful evidence isn't in a file, it's in a child's eyes. Years later, a new clerk would start at the courthouse. On her first day, she'd be shown the quiet room and told, "If a child ever seems scared, bring them here, no matter what." She'd ask why, and someone would tell her a story, not with names or dates, but with feeling. A story about a little girl, 4 words, and a judge who turned pale. And she'd understand, because the legacy of that day wasn't punishment or fame, it was awareness. It was change that grew slowly like a sunflower, rooted in truth, reaching for light. The girl never became a symbol. She didn't want to be. She just wanted to be a kid, to swing on a swing set, to argue about bedtime, to believe the world could be kind. And thanks to her courage and the people who finally chose to listen, She got that chance. So while the courthouse kept its marble floors and heavy doors, something softer lived inside it now. A promise, unspoken but real. We're listening, even when you whisper. And sometimes that's all it takes to change everything.